Hi guys, I'm Steve of the eponymous How Steve English. Here's how this guide is gonna go. I'm gonna tell you how I run my ESL speaking classes, and then I'm gonna give you 3 awesome ESL speaking lesson plans to use with your students. And if you're here just for the free resources, just go ahead to the description below and you can go to our blog post link and then download them from there. It's hard to find quality ESL speaking activities. ESL speaking activities for primary, secondary, and adult ESL students should be a dime a dozen. You should be able to go to Google, type those lovely keywords in, and find a ton of great resources to use. Go ahead, try it for yourself. Search ESL speaking activities. Search have you ever ESL questions, or fun ESL question patterns, or whatever else you can think of. What did you find? Probably a few boring HTML sites with questions just copy and pasted onto the page. Or worse, a neon bright homepage with flash animations ripped straight from a 90s page builder. Those things are just not very useful for a teacher who's looking for meaningful exercises in class. So who's this random internet dude talking to you? And what am I going to give you for free? I'm Steve from How Steve English, if the site URL didn't give that bit away. Today, I'm really hoping to discuss ways to provide meaningful ESL speaking activities that will give progress for your ESL students, great speaking practice to strengthen their abilities, and about 3 different free resources to make sure your class is really fun. Remember, ESL students learn better through motivation, and having a fun time with your classmates is the best motivation of all. And that's how we always design our lessons. We always try to make them fun for the classroom. Now, before we get going, I just want to talk about your classroom. I want to give you some advice and some pointers on what I think is the best way to run an ESL class. First things first, your students should actually speak in class. In my opinion, students' speaking output should occupy the majority of the class time. And remember, output just means the ESL students are producing something in that target language. For the majority of ESL teachers out there, especially native English speaker teachers, your goal is usually going to be speaking. So my basic formula is pretty simple. In my class, I generally do a 5-minute review of the previous class, 10 minutes instruction on new vocabulary, 10 minutes drilling of the new grammar, and then 25 to 30 minutes of pair work, which would be my student output. I assign writing activities for homework, so I'm able to hit all 4 skills in every class between in-class and at-home activities. This is the method I recommend for most teachers. If you spend too much time in front of the class lecturing the ESL students droning on, they'll never have a chance to actually use the language. And without an opportunity to use the language, they'll never retain any of the information that you've given them. Not only is it a poor use of your time, it's just going to make you and your students really, really frustrated. So once you have a basic idea of what you're going to do with class time, you got to make sure that you've nipped your bad teaching habits in the bud. There's a time and a place for everything, but if you want your ESL students to actually become great English speakers, they need pair work, and they need output time. Now, in my opinion, pair work is better than group work. Remember this. For ESL speaking activities, the best way for students to reinforce what they've learned is through pair work. In groups of 3 or larger, the students don't get speaking time. They just don't. It's simple math. If you give the students 25 minutes of total class time for speaking in pairs, then ideally each student will receive 12 minutes and 30 seconds to speak. But if there are 3 kids in the group, then each child will only be able to speak for 8 minutes and 20 seconds. With 4 kids, 6 minutes and 25 seconds. Think about that. The difference between 2 students talking together in a pair and 4 students talking together in a group is a reduction of half of available speaking time. If you do that all year long, the students are basically missing out on an entire 6-month spread of speaking practice that they would otherwise have received. If you're worried about them missing out on opportunities to talk to everyone in class, then just change the pairs every 2 minutes or so. And I know I say this a lot, but students really don't learn from painful 40-minute grammar explanations. They learn from doing. When instructing students, you should only explain as much as needed. Especially with young ESL students, I've often seen teachers commit the sin of over-explaining each and every point on the board. Let's take have you ever, for example. The present perfect simple is a fantastic verb tense to use with ESL students. Specifically, it's used to describe experiences more often than not. That's something students love to talk to each other about. You really don't need to push them that hard to use have you ever in fun conversations. And you don't really need to hold their hands while teaching the grammar points. Just write down the grammar patterns on the board and let the kids figure it out on their own. For example, every day I write down the verb tense we'll be using in class. I write down that tense's structure in question, short answer, and statement form. To teach the students, I read off the question once to myself and answer it to myself. I then ask 3 to 5 students a question and allow them to figure out the short answer grammar with their own intuition. It's written on the board, isn't it? They must be able to put 2 and 2 together, so to speak. After they've responded, I'll ask them to volunteer to ask me questions using this format. Again, I'll select 3 to 5 students to do that. And remember, it's totally fine if they don't get it at first. Some days the ESL students don't quite understand. They can't quite grasp the difference between I have been to the park versus I went to the park. Or they're struggling with where to place adverbs in the midst of all those words. That's fine. It takes 5 experiences with a new topic to actually learn it anyway. But in a speaking class, you really need to focus on the students speaking. You mustn't focus on your lecturing or the minutiae of a sentence structure. Find the goal of each lesson, typically the target language, and only focus on that for the day. If you focus too much on this or too much on that and do anything that reduces the actual amount of time the ESL students will spend speaking in class, then you'll only hurt their progress, no matter what you might think or how much you think you might be helping. And I know your students are making silly mistakes, or you've got some super low-level students who are butchering everything coming out of their mouths. That doesn't really matter. Focus on today's goals, the lesson's target language. And I know I say this a lot, but students really don't learn from painful 40-minute grammar explanations. They learn from doing. When instructing students, you should only explain as much as needed. Especially with young ESL students, I've often seen teachers commit the sin of over-explaining each and every point on the board. Let's take have you ever, for example. The present perfect simple is a fantastic verb tense to use with ESL students. Specifically, it's used to describe experiences more often than not. That's something students love to talk to each other about. You really don't need to push them that hard to use have you ever in fun conversations. And you don't really need to hold their hands while teaching the grammar points. Just write down the grammar patterns on the board and let the kids figure it out on their own. For example, every day I write down the verb tense we'll be using in class. I write down that tense's structure in question, short answer, and statement form. To teach the students, I read off the question once to myself and answer it myself. I then ask 3 to 5 students a question and allow them to figure out the short answer grammar with their own intuition. It's written on the board, isn't it? They must be able to put 2 and 2 together, so to speak. After they've responded, I'll ask them to volunteer to ask me questions using this format. Again, I'll select 3 to 5 students to do that. And remember, it's totally fine if they don't get it at first. Some days the ESL students don't quite understand. They can't quite grasp the difference between I have been to the park versus I went to the park. Or they're struggling with where to place adverbs in the midst of all those words. That's fine. It takes 5 experiences with a new topic to actually learn it anyway. But in a speaking class, you really need to focus on the students speaking. You mustn't focus on your lecturing or the minutiae of a sentence structure. Find the goal of each lesson, typically the target language, and only focus on that for the day. If you focus too much on this or too much on that and do anything that reduces the actual amount of time the ESL students will spend speaking in class, then you'll only hurt their progress, no matter what you might think or how much you think you might be helping. And I know your students are making silly mistakes, or you've got some super low-level students who are butchering everything coming out of their mouths. That doesn't really matter. Focus on today's goals, the lesson's target language. As long as they're hitting in and about that goal, then they're doing fine. You should be revisiting these topics again and again and again throughout the year, so after about a year or two, the students should be able to understand this pretty well because you've revisited so often. Now, here's how I would apply these points in a lesson on have you ever. The most important reason to use this verb tense is to describe experiences. That's the first rule I always teach my students when we introduce the present perfect simple. So to warm the kids up, make a slideshow. Use some crazy images of food, expensive lobster, super spicy ramen, or even gigantic cheeseburgers. So you go ahead and make a few sentences. I have never eaten spicy ramen, or I have eaten a gigantic cheeseburger. After you make a few sentences, have your ESL students produce their own. Then break them into pairs to ask each other about experiences of their own. When they finish talking, have them summarize their partner's responses to you. And today I've decided to use the present perfect simple question, have you ever? It's important to note that the present perfect simple question, have you ever, is typically A2 level. A2 level just means high beginner. But that's a bit misleading. Unless you're in a very competitive area with a lot of private academies that your students go to, A2 is pretty high for primary, secondary, or even adult students. It means the student is able to comfortably respond to questions and hold basic conversations on their own. But they're not at the point of being independent users of the language. They'll probably still need help in most situations, whether that means using their phones to translate or relying on a friend. Especially for ESL teachers in Asia, A2 level can be a little tough to find. Because of that, you'll be wanting to use really simple vocabulary in these exercises. All right, so our first exercise is speed dating. This is my favorite ESL speaking activity. I do it almost every day with my classes, from kindergarten all the way up to adults. In this activity, the ESL students will pick a verb tense, or the teacher will pick a verb tense. Today, we're using have you ever. So I'll make about 10 to 15 fun questions for the students to use. Have you ever traveled to Japan? Have you ever traveled to Tokyo? Have you ever eaten really spicy ramen? Have you ever eaten very expensive pizza? Have you ever seen the Avengers movie? Have you ever seen an old man singing in the street? I break the ESL students into pairs. I set a timer for 2 to 3 minutes, and during that time, they should ask and answer as many questions as they possibly can in a conversation. And they have to use the short answer plus sentence form. They can't just say yes or no. For example, I expect them to say in their answer to a question, have you ever been to Spain? They should say, yes, I have. I have traveled to Spain. Or no, I haven't. I haven't traveled to Spain. Once time's up, I ask each student to tell me one interesting fact about what their partner had said. The student should use complete sentences at that point. She has never been to Spain, or she has been to Spain 3 times. After everyone has responded, I assign the students to new partners, and the cycle continues. I do this for at least 3 rotations. If we have a lot more time in class, I ask the students to write down 5 of their own fun questions using the have you ever present perfect simple structure. After which, the students will talk for 1 to 3 more rounds. For homework, the students should write responses to the questions that I provided them. Remember, during the entire class time they were speaking, so we still need to give them some writing work to get used to the have you ever structure. So the questions I provided them, I'll expect them to write their own answers on that for homework. Speed dating is a great activity. I really haven't found a better, more consistent, engaging activity for the students to do every day. This is the backbone of my class and one that provides me great results. Of all the ESL speaking activities, I really think that ESL speed dating should be a fundamental part of any speaking class. In this entire activity, the ESL students get to practice speaking in first, second, and third person as well, which is a great bonus. I've got attachments in the description below for links to download my free version of our lesson, and if you want the full lesson, I've also provided a link for that as well. Alright, my activity number 2 is famous characters. As teachers, we sometimes forget that we were once students. When you were learning a new language, were you happily engaged in an activity if the teacher gave you a drab Word document and told you, here, have a conversation? Probably not. Every new twist to an activity makes it that much more interesting to your students. Add some color to your fonts. Add some images to your files. Insert a video. All of these are fun additions that help your students engage with your material. That's why a simple game of famous characters is so much more fun than anything else. This ESL speaking activity is pretty simple. Get about 20 pictures of famous characters. I recommend using 15 worldwide famous characters and 5 that are culturally relevant to your students. For example, it could be the school mascot, the local country's president, or anything from their specific pop culture. Print out those pictures so they're about the size of a playing card and make little decks. My pile of cards includes characters like Yoda, Simba, Iron Man, Shazam, and a local Korean favorite, Pororo. I separate the ESL students into pairs. Again, remember that pairs are the most effective way for students to gain English speaking experience. I place a deck of these famous characters on the desk in front of each pair of students and time them. I give them 3 minutes to speak and describe the characters. Remember, we're focusing on the have you ever grammar pattern, so that's what I would expect the students to produce. When the timer rings, I allow the ESL students to repeat the sentences to me. I award them 1 point for a positive statement, Iron Man has fought his friends, for example, and 2 points for a negative statement. Yoda has never eaten a cheeseburger, for example. After I've recorded all these points, I reassign the partners and have them continue as long as class time remains. Now, I've also provided some samples of these below, so go ahead and click them if you want to give it a go. And our last activity is 2 truths, 1 lie. I love this game. It's really fun to play with ESL students, no matter their age. At this part of the ESL speaking activities list, I'm starting to break a few of my own rules. 2 truths, 1 lie is ideally a game played in a group setting. And if you were to play it in pairs, it really requires energetic students to do so. The premise of this ESL game is pretty simple. Each student should write down 2 truths and 1 lie on a small piece of paper. Remember, we are focusing on the have you ever grammar pattern. Divide them into pairs again and set a timer for 3 minutes. Have the students pick and prod each other to see which statements are true and which one is a lie. Now, if you don't want to do the pairs, you can go ahead and do a group. But again, you're going to miss out on that valuable speaking time. Now, when you're playing the game, somebody's piece of paper should have 2 truths and 1 lie. For example, I would write down, I have visited New York City, I have never talked to the president, I have never taken an airplane. The students shouldn't ask me directly, have you ever visited New York City? That wouldn't be fun. Instead, they should ask me interesting questions that a person who visited New York City should know. For example, have you ever been to the Statue of Liberty? Or have you ever eaten New York-style pizza? During this ESL game in particular, it's okay for students to ask questions using not just present perfect simple, but past simple as well. Did you eat pizza in New York? Or what did you do in New York? But they should try to divide their questions evenly between present perfect simple and past simple. Once the timer goes off, ask each student what they think their partner's lie was, and award them points if they're correct. Once they've done that, assign the students to new partners and go through the cycle again. For homework, have the students write down 5 present perfect simple sentences about each partner they talk to. That's pretty much the extent of this activity. It's usually pretty fun to play in a large group, but I wouldn't recommend that for a normal class. As you know, the more students you involved in an activity, the less time each student individually gets to speak. But on rare occasions, if you really want to play a large, fun game, 2 truths, 1 lie is definitely the one to do it with. I've attached links to download this in our sample lessons, and I've attached a link to our full lesson as well. Alright, let's close this out. In general, I like to use the same speaking activities over and over again. I know a lot of teachers invest time and effort into arts, crafts, and other tools for their classrooms. Those methods might work for some, but I've often found that those types of games or activities take precious time away from my class's true focus, which is speaking. With that in mind, I highly recommend that you use these ESL speaking activities in your classroom. Whether you choose speed dating famous characters or 2 truths, 1 lie, you're bound to find that your students' overall retention and fluency will increase over the months and years. For more articles like this and other free tidbits, make sure you sign up for our newsletter on our website. We might even give you some freebies. And if you want to have unlimited access to all of our resources, make sure you visit us at howandstevenglish.com and check out our teacher memberships. We have over 1,000 resources. That's conversation games, pattern English activities, flashcards, and card games and board games for $9.99 a month. All right, I'll catch you guys next time.